Now, you may have noticed in our demonstration of tables that up here we've got the word pivot table. Now, pivot table sounds really scary if you've not used it, but it's actually very easy to use, well, moderately easy to use, and can save you a huge amount of time. And as it says up here, it is all about summarizing data. So, what do we mean by summarizing data? Well, let's have a look at this column, file extensions. There are 3 different file extensions that we got: M4B, MP3 and WMA. There's also some blanks that I've got when I've just created these new rows. Now let's say I wanted to know the number of files that are WMA, the number of files that are MP3 and the number of files that are M4B. So that is summarizing the data. That's all that is. And pivot tables allow you to do that quickly. Now, you don't actually have to have a table to create a pivot table. All you need is something that's sensibly organized. So for instance, if I was counting the file extensions, I would need it all in the one column. So highlight what you want first. So in other words, your source data. So I can highlight this entire table, except I don't need to highlight tables. You can do if you want, but it's not actually necessary. But so let's highlight the table, and I want to insert a pivot table. Yes, there are other ways of doing it, especially if you use tables, but this will work for all of them. So insert pivot table. So it's saying, what do you want to base it on? Well, this table. And where do you want to put it? A new worksheet. Okay, so let's click OK. And we have absolutely nothing, because we've not told the computer what we want to summarize. So what we want to summarize goes into rows, and how we want to summarize it goes into values. So I want to summarize the file extensions. So I want to report by file extension. So that goes into rows. And as soon as I drag that in, look what happens. We have a series of rows, each of which contains a different file extensions. And that's a great way to summarize data. I could say that's all I wanted. I just wanted to know what file extensions I've got. But I want to know how many there are. So I'm going to drag file extension into values. And there it's giving me the count. So I've got 1 M4B, I've got 189 MP3, and I've got 671 WMA. And of course, if I want to look at that graphically, I could just put in a data bar. Now, as soon as I click outside of pivot table, we lose all of this pivot table paraphernalia. So, like tables, we get lots of menus, but only when we're inside the pivot table. Okay, I want more than that. I want to know what the total size is. Okay, so I'm going to drag size into the values as well. And it's giving me the count of size, which isn't what I want. I want the sum. So instead of that, I click on count of size, going to value field settings, and I change it from count to sum. Click OK, and that's it. Now I can go into it again and change the number format. So let's say I want that number format, and there we go. Hopefully not so frightening. So I'm just going to remove the count and just leave the sum. Now you can see you can drag and drop. That's all it is. Drag and drop information from here into rows or values. Now, why is it called a pivot table? Because you can drag this into rows, or you could drag it into columns. So what's the point of that? Well, let's go back into our catalogue and let's add a new field which is called year. And this is the year that it was last, well, I think all the access dates are the same, so let's use the date modified. So I'm going to use a function called year. So I'm going into that, and so you can see the year that a particular file was last modified. Press enter, you can see it all updates. So we've got a variety of styles. So I'll go back into my pivot table and I drag, what did I call it? I drag year. I drag year, oh, it's not there. And this is one of the things about pivot tables. It doesn't automatically update. I can change the data that it relies on, but the pivot table will remain the same. If I want the pivot table to be updated, I need to refresh it. And the easiest way, right and click and go refresh. You can also go into pivot table tools, analyze, refresh, but I just right and click and refresh. So that will update the data. That'll also update the structure. So now we have year. So there's two ways I could do this. I could drag the year into the rows. And now you can see that I've got 5 different years for MP3. I've got 6 different years for WMA. The alternative is I could drag year into columns. That's right, and this is what it means by pivoting. Pivot means using basically rows and columns. That's all pivot table means. And you can see that I've got, maybe if I change this back to a count, there we are, you can see I've got 22 WMA files which have a date modified of 2008. If you're wondering why 1900 in this case means there is no year. So I've got 2 blank files without the year properly inserted. So I'll need to update that formula if I wanted to get it working properly. So if I was saying if the date modified is equal to 0, then put nothing, otherwise put the year. So that you can now see that the year is blank, and now when I refresh this, because I've changed the data, but that doesn't automatically update the pivot table, refresh, there we now have a blank column. And if I want to interrogate the pivot table, I want to know what these 5 files are. That's easy, just double click and a new spreadsheet is created with those 5 particular files. So pivot tables sounds frightening, not so much once you actually get into it. And you can also got, for later versions of Microsoft Excel, recommended pivot tables, which gives you suggestions about what you might want to use. And you can see a quick demo of what that might look like. Now, if you're using a table, then the great thing about it is you can expand the table as much as you want, and when you refresh the pivot table, then the data will now be the entirety of the table, not just the initial rows. And that's another good reason for using tables. It keeps the entirety of the data as one particular object, as an entire table. So you can expand the table, and the pivot table will be expanded to reflect this new data once you refresh. So hopefully you can see how easy it is to use, how quick, maybe how much time you can save just being able to go, oh right, so I want to know how many particular folders, how many particular files are in each particular path. And you can see I'm literally doing it as I speak. And I also want the earliest date modified. So I need to use number formatting. There we go. And I want to use and I want the latest date modified as well. Very quick, very easy, non-destructive because it doesn't actually alter your original data. But you can see how quickly was that done. So pivot tables recommended if you want to summarize your data very quickly.